Hey, we're live.
All right, good afternoon. We are reconvening our meeting after discovering that we have discussion on S-127, the Senate Housing Bill. After yesterday's testimony from Matt Chapman on brownfields, we haven't had a chance to talk with our legislative council and have committee discussion amongst ourselves about the brownfield section of the bill. Additionally, there's a section that is relying on the tiers of Act 250 that we talked about with our other legislative council yesterday that I have been talking with the chairs of the, members of the other committees who are working on this bill, Abby Duke and Charlie Kimball, about how they're going to be changing the boundaries of it. So for us to respond now, it's a little premature until we know what they're actually thinking about. And we can weigh in on the land use, the application of the land use to that program. So with that, Representative Chapin, do you want to begin, or Michael, do you want to sort of share your thoughts on Section 10 with us first, maybe?
First, Section 10 is not about brownfields. Section 10 is about developments.
Thank you. Right. Yep.
Development soils are unconsolidated mineral and organic matter overlying bedrock that contains polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, arsenic, or lead in concentrations that exceed the relevant soil screening level for residential soil. And when managed in compliance with certain other solid waste laws, pose no greater risk than the agency established soil screening value for the intended reuse of the property. No unreasonable risk to human health through a dermal inhalation or ingestion exposure pathway. Do not leach compounds at concentrations that exceed groundwater enforcement standards and do not result in an exceedance of Vermont groundwater enforcement standards. So that is what a development soil is. It has to meet all of those criteria, including that it's not going to leach and it's not going to pose a threat to the groundwater enforcement standards. And you also should be aware that there is a statute relating to development soils, and it hasn't been very successful. And because it largely depends on creation of or licensing certification of what are called categorical facilities, a place where you can send these development soils just for management there. And they just haven't been licensed. Nobody's applied. There's been one application and it was withdrawn. And so that leaves the developer who's developing usually in a more urban area, but not necessarily. It could have been around a commercial or industrial site in a rural area where the PAs exceed the soil standards, and then that developer, that owner, has to move that soil somewhere. They can deal with it on site if they have the ability to manage it appropriately on site. And if they can't, then right now they have to take it to the landfill or truck it somewhere else. And so there's concern that it's expensive to truck to the landfill. It's problematic to take it to the landfill, just feasibility wise. And it's not necessarily something that's so hazardous that it has to be dealt with in a landfill. And the agency honestly already has the authority to do this. They already have insignificant waste event authority. They already have receiving site authority. They're basically coming to you to say, this is how we want to do it. We want to give developers another option, I'm going to be clear about what needs to be done for that option. I mean, if the landfill tomorrow shut down acceptance of development soils, A&R probably could go to insignificant waste event permits to deal with movement of this soil. They kind of already have that authority. But they're being clear about how they would exercise it. And that's what section 10 of 127 would do. And so it is not a categorical facility where these soils would be transferred to. It is an event. And that means it's a discrete place where waste can be disposed of in a discrete instance or discrete instances. It's not going to be a facility where there's going to be truckloads and truckloads and truckloads of waste going to it. It's there for discrete use, going to be under an agreement between the developer and the landowner. It has to meet these requirements. It has to be generated from a hazardous material site managed pursuant to a corrective action plan or a soil management plan. All right. It's hazardous material because it exceeds the soil screening levels for PAS and arsenic or lead. It's not because it's got, plutonium or some other hexavalent chromium. It's not because of that. It's because it has development soils that have exceeded the soil standards. And they've been tested for arsenic, lead, and the polyaromatic hydrocarbons pursuant to a monitoring plan approved by the secretary that ensures the soils do not leach above groundwater, which is a standard for development soils. The location where the soils are managed is appropriate and a type of material for the type of material managed and are capped in a manner approved by the secretary. Any activity that may disturb it shall be conducted pursuant to a soil management plan approved by the secretary, and the permittee files a record notice where the soils are managed in the land record. So it is known for any future developer or future owner of that land that there is this insignificant waste event site approved on the property. I look at this and I think Matt did a pretty good job of laying out criteria for how this could be used. And I don't know what else to say.
Thank you. Representative Bartholomew.
When you first started out, you were reading something, is that from the bill?
When I first started, I was reading a definition of development soils from 10 VSA 6.
Okay, that was not in the bill.
602. Right. So this section is being added to the solid waste chapter. So it's in statute. And so the definitions that apply to the chapter apply to this section. One of the definitions in that chapter is the definition of development soils. So now a developer is going to have 3 or more options for disposal of this. Manage it on site, truck it to a landfill, find a receiving site that gets an insignificant waste event permit under this language, or somebody somewhere sometime under the rainbow gets a categorical waste facility.
Representative Austin.
Do we know of any other states that are using this type of procedure and how long they've been doing it? And
So you can't really say an apples to apples comparison because soil standards, screening levels are different state to state, and Vermont does have more protective soil screening levels than other states. So this isn't partly to deal with those soil screening levels that Vermont has that other states don't. But landfill disposal for hazardous soils, yes. Incineration of hazardous soils in other states, not in Vermont. You can't burn waste in Vermont. Different types of facilities for disposal, yes. Other states have that.
Representative Chapin.
I think my biggest concern, and Matt Chapman got at this a little bit, and maybe you can help me with it, is just, so we know there's 3 materials in here that are not appropriate at this level for residential area, but would fall under the standards for other kinds of development, or other kinds of sites, especially as long as it's capped. What I want to understand is how likely are we to be moving other kinds of contaminants along with those that we're not so aware of? Even into like, we know about certain chemicals now compared to 10 years ago has changed a lot. So I'm a little bit worried about, I am worried about that. I think I asked this already of Matt, but is it clear that the state is requiring testing of those soils for lots of other things?
So they have,
And
they have-
that's all what's in that, and wouldn't be moving that if other things were also of concern. Is that?
they have to do a soil management plan, right? So they have, and there's requirements for that in rule. And then testing is something that I'll have to confirm that it's required. I don't think it's actually. I have to look at the mandate for it, but if you're building in an urban environment, the first thing you need to do is do a core sample. And then if that comes out with anything that's an exceedance level, you don't buy the property. Or you negotiate away the liability. And I used to do that. And so that if that phase 1 core sample came back with anything, we would probably walk away. But if we really like the property, we'd do a phase 2 with the more comprehensive analysis, and then we do a risk management plan to see how we would want to manage the liability risk. And if we still wanted the property, we would try to negotiate the liability away, which only really desperate people do. Or we would pay for it. We will pay for them to take the liability. So that's kind of the scenario you're in. I have to check about whether or not any development in an urban area is going to require a soil sample. I can't say for sure off the top of my head.
Just to be clear, I'm just trying to say, if we're in the scenario in which the state would be approving moving these somewhat contaminated soils, these development soils, to another location,
Right, which is
another used property.
pretty much every development in any of the towns
Would have these
cities in
development
the
soils.
state.
Right. So in order to move these development soils to another property that's not a landfill,
Right.
the state would know by then if there were other contaminants also in that soil. That's what I'm trying to get at.
Right, and if it's tripping any of the other hazardous materials standards, it's going to be dealt with as hazardous waste.
So it would no longer be a development soil.
It will no longer be a development soil.
So in order to be a development soil, it's not contaminated with a bunch of other things. That's what I'm just trying to get at. Okay. Thanks.
Representative Austin.
It doesn't exceed the soil screening levels for that. It's not that it doesn't have a contaminant in it. It doesn't exceed the soil screening.
Residential use.
Representative Austin.
Yeah, on line 9, the secretary ensures that the soils do not reach above.
What page are you on?
I'm on page 21. intrusive soils do not reach above groundwater enforcement standards. I'm just wondering with the increase of water, rain incidences due to climate change. I don't know what the groundwater enforcement standards, I'd be concerned with the changing climate, with the amount of rain that we're getting and flooding, if those standards have been up, take that into consideration.
So generally, yes. What the I can go like deep in a hole right now if you want me to.
I just wanted,
Not too deep, just
Yeah.
maybe.
Okay. So you designated, General Assembly designated groundwater as a public trust resource about 15 years ago. Nobody knew what that meant at the time. And that left it to the courts to determine what obligation the state had managing groundwater to comply with the public trust in that water. Like comply with the public trust, meaning that manage that water so that all the citizens of the state have it available to them for the uses that they want or need. And so that was not defined in the declaration of the public trust for groundwater. So the courts looked at it and the courts decided that meant that A&R for almost every regulatory action that they are going to take that might affect groundwater has to review whether that action is going to affect the public trust in groundwater. And so in order to ensure that that was met, they enacted by rule the groundwater enforcement standards. And so it is a rule that lays out how the agency will permit activities that could affect groundwater. And generally it has a standard that says it cannot impact groundwater in a way that would impair the use of that for its traditional uses. It does take into account changes in water table. It does take into account drought. So that's what the groundwater enforcement standards are. And they do amend them. I think they're on like a 5-year cycle.
just concerned about flooding. You know, much more water now sitting on that land, and if the groundwater will be safe.
Right. I mean, that's not a permitted activity though, right? The flooding is not something that A&R is permitting,
Right.
but they do take into account the water table, the water level, for purposes of the permitted activity. So if flooding or rainfall or increased precipitation is raising the water table, that is something that would have to be taken into consideration.
And I would think that more water would mean dilution, but I think it may possibly, unless it's more standing water on the contaminated soils, but the way it's written also, as Michael said, they're revisiting those standards.
Yeah.
So
Thank you.
periodically. Representative Chi.
This is helpful. Thanks for going through the definition in particular. I feel a lot more comfortable about it today. I also just reflecting on the fact that every 2 years, the agency's going to be reporting to our committee and Senate Natural Resources on how this is going, what it's being used for. So that to me means there'll be an instigator to make sure we're all paying attention to it. So I feel a lot more comfortable with it. I did really like the idea of sunset on the prioritization of housing for
For brownfields.
brownfields. So I did want to go back to the brownfields piece. I do think it makes sense in this moment to be particularly prioritizing housing, but I don't like making that a permanent solution when funding is so limited for brownfields and it's so expensive when we have kinds of projects that are important.
Yeah, Representative Logan.
If we were to include a sunset, would you want to do something like when the housing vacancy rate reaches a certain level or there's something like that? Or did you have some sort of?
I'd rather make it a time like 4 or 5 years. And to get data on, we have projects that now are a priority, but have now been waiting for 10 or 20 years to get support. I guess I'm more interested in what are the actual projects and what's being pitted against the other for funding.
Is that our decision?
Well, Michael, can we visit that section? Because I think it's those, it's an intent more than anything else, right? It's not kind of binding language. I'm not saying I don't want to have the conversation, but I want to look at it closely.
It's not just an intent statement.
Okay, can you tell us where you are?
On page 23, line 8 and 9. This is where BRELA, the Brownfields program, is created. And there's a whole process that the agencies, because it's natural resources and it's commerce and community development, they go through to review for A&R, it's the environmental criteria for use of the property, how it's going to be managed, its threat to groundwater, what potential public health or environmental risk is there. For ACCD, it's basically the economic development use of the property. And that's largely because ACCD has a program to foster and encourage these types of developments, often through economic development authorities or RPCs. But they do a review, and let's just step back. Why are they doing the review? Because the hook, the bonus that a developer, the goal that the developer gets out of a brownfield certification is their release from state liability. So when there's hazardous material on a site, the owner, operator, ranger, transporter is liable for the cleanup of that. On a brownfield site, they do the review to determine whether or not it is suitable for redevelopment, whether or not it poses a threat, whether or not that threat can be managed, whether and how it's going to be managed. And then they develop a plan for it. And the developer, purchaser, acquirer, company, whomever, agrees to implement that plan. And with that agreement to that plan, they get a letter releasing them from liability under state law. And technically, you can try to get one from the feds too, but that's just not really that common. And so that's what brownfields is. It's like, how do you get people? How do you encourage people? How do you incentivize people to develop on property that has potential risks of contamination? You do that by releasing them from liability. But before you do that, you have to do this review. So this language says when you are doing that review for brownfields, you are going to prioritize the review of remediation at a site that contains housing. So in the next however many years before sunset, if you do a sunset, that when the reviews are being done, they're going to prioritize those reviews for sites with housing. How many have housing? I don't. That's a question for A&R ACCD. They do get housing built on them, but they do get housing built on them.
Brownfield sites. Yeah, Matt brought us data yesterday. And I forwarded an email, but I don't think I hit include the content of it. So I'll resend that to the members. But the data he showed us was from 2021. Did you all see the content of that email? You're nodding. Okay. For some reason, Annika didn't get it. Anyway, it's a not insignificant number of the projects were housing related. And
You get them a lot in towns that have large industrial factories that are repurposed for housing, condominiums, things like that, apartment buildings. That I've worked on those before. And it's not an easy process. Because I mean, it's a public health balance versus the economic development need. And it's a process.
Has that ever backfired on people? Has a previously industrial site ever been shown to cause illness in the residents?
Personal experience, purchased, sold facility that was once used to manufacture light bulbs. Purchaser went through all of the development, did all of the testing, got the plans, did everything right, redeveloped, sold condominiums in the redevelopment, turned the heat on, and mercury leached out of the wood that they left exposed because
Beautiful.
it was beautiful. And that property was bought back and shut down. Had a fence put around it.
Oh, that's right. That was scary.
It's not in this list.
Yeah. That was not in Vermont, I take it. Yeah. Do you know how common that is?
I don't think it's that common. That was just I won't say it's a fluke, but it was strange. And then you can find other strange things like this is another one I worked on, a TV station in Texas. And it was pristine. And we wanted to develop an expansion of it. And we went to test the land where we were going to do the expansion. And it was kicking back off the charts for lead. We couldn't figure out why. And then somebody noticed picnic tables set up at this weird angle. At lunchtime, the guys that ran the garage that they had for the TV station would go out and shoot groundhog or gophers, prairie dog. And they've been doing it for decades. And it turned the site into a brownfield site.
It's uplifting. Further concerns on this section of the bill?
I'm just looking through the list of things that have been under the state program awards,
Mhm.
you know, and there's some really great, not, most of the projects have housing over the last number of years. But some of them don't and are projects. I just, I don't know, can you describe a little bit more about how will this little section influence their decision-making? Will we see?
For brownfields?
Yeah.
Or no, for how this prioritization will?
Yes.
I think it's really going to, because it's a manpower, person power review, right? It's gonna require some reallocation of person power over this period to prioritize the review for housing. I think that's really where you're gonna see that where the priority will make a difference.
Was there just a B missing here? There's ellipses and then there's an A, some ellipse and then,
That's what the asterisk, it skips over.
I know, but is it just a B or are there more? And what is it?
No, there's subdivisions under A and then there's a B.
I'm curious what they are. I mean, what are the other things they're looking at? Are there other priorities in that list?
The refresh my memory.
I can tell you, looking at the list, the outputs are either housing or jobs.
Housing or what?
Jobs. So, you know,
So
they're commercial.
above the C that's housing, there's more housing stuff.
I'm not looking at the legislation right now, or the statute.
Oh, that's,
So under A, it says the program shall be administered by the secretary who shall specify an appropriate amount or type of insurance, require the posting of a bond or other form of financial assurance, or establish other qualifications for persons carrying out activities related to the cleanup. And A2 would be contract with private engineers, hydrologists, and site professionals to provide the investigation and review required by the subchapter. And there's something about the contracts there that I won't read. And then 3, release an applicant from state liability, provide the applicant is in compliance with the subchapter. And then B is after approval of the site investigation work plan or corrective action plan, the secretary shall notify the person of any future requirements under the subchapter, including a tentative schedule of processing times.
okay, thank you. I guess one thought I'm having is that, our interest in the brownfields program is more environmental than economic development. And that we could make a suggestion to the Commerce Committee as they're reviewing it, if that's the preference of our whole committee. Or you as an individual can make that suggestion if it's not. To put a time boundary on that, but I don't feel like it's really an environmental concern. Do others have the same concern that Representative Chapin has, Representative Logan?
I don't. So, yeah, I think you can't have jobs if you don't have housing for people to have, you know. So but that, I also think it's just not our committee jurisdiction.
Okay. Others thoughts on this section or concerns? Did you have one? Okay. Michael, are there other sections of this bill that you're involved in?
No, just the development soils and the brownfields language.
And one-time appropriation, right? Oh, the environmental contingency fund. Actually, well, that's right below this. Remind us.
Oh, I consider that part of the, but that is really just allowing money that had been sent to DEC to go to the contingency fund, and that gives them more flexibility to use it.
He said that the way the calendar's working, the way it was set up, they had to come back to us and we're not in session. Do I have that right?
If it goes to a department and it's not used, then you had to go through budget adjustment. And if it goes into the fund rolls over, and the fund actually has a lot more potential uses than just appropriating it to a department. So this actually gives them a lot more flexibility to use that money and to not have to come back here and get reapproval for anything that they haven't spent in a fiscal year.
Concerns over that?
Just a question. So this $2.5 million in the general fund is appropriation is not new money. That's just, it's money that's already
Well,
allocated.
It was already
a
appropriated.
one-time allocation.
Yeah.
But do we allocate money every year?
Uh,
This fund,
I'm sorry for
do we typically allocate money to the environmental, well, yeah.
the environmental contingency fund has varying demands. In some years the fund gets low, and some years it's healthy. But when it gets low, you do appropriate money to it. Or transfer money. You were transferring money from the waste management assistance account to the ECF for a little bit because that was healthy, but that aggravated the swimmies because they were supposed to get a cut of the waste management assistance account, and anything that was going out of the account they saw as something that they lost. but then the General Assembly gave them an incentive to allow for it. The money can't be moved from the Waste Management Assistance Account until to the ECF unless you give more money to the swimmies.
All right. Further thoughts on the housing bill?
Madam Chair, thanks. We're not gonna take a position on it then, because we're thinking we're environmental, not housing.
On this prioritization piece, I mean, we can have further discussion on it. I have heard from two people on the committee about it, that suggestion. One is in favor and one is not. So if others want to comment, feel free.
Yeah, be careful because we're online, but having a community that's had brownfield sites in process for going on multiple decades now, that's plural. With no relief, and now we're shifting the emphasis onto housing. And like I said yesterday, I understand housing, we need housing. I understand it, but I am just feeling that communities such as ours, and there are others, are going to be further left behind, and that decades, which is now becoming plural, is just going to extend to more decades. And it makes it difficult for me to support this. I get it, but we don't get it.
Yeah. So are you talking about like projects that cost so much that it's just taking a long time because it's so much, but there's a proposed use for that parcel, or you're just trying to get it ready for a use? I'm asking because is there a possibility it could be housing?
It's privately owned, well, it's owned by a regional development corporation, so would it be housing? Most likely not, that's not the preference. Although they do have one site, they're looking at trying to put housing in there. Talking about industrial sites that are badly contaminated. And there's been some relief over the years. I think I've stated in this committee before, version of this committee, it's like building a house and not putting a roof on it. There's more work to be done. And, we're struggling. Yeah, so we have prime property inside a 4-lane highway within 3 miles of the interstate. We can't get it to work. And the state has, nope, I said I wasn't going to bed. I'm not going to put it on record. It's been frustrating. It's a struggle.
There is a deeper dive as part of the bill into the brownfields program that hopefully will look at some of the process issues that maybe are holding you up.
And I think several of our properties are on there.
On this, yeah. Representative Chapin.
Just on the environmental piece, and I should know the answer to this, but I don't, not right now. Properties that are brownfields, have they been stabilized in terms of continued ongoing leaching or environmental contamination for the community? Like, I guess this is what I'm trying to get at, like.
Primary stabilization.
I thought that the state was prioritizing this based on like public health and in addition to what the project will bring when it's redeveloped, but maybe more importantly to me is what's the most important sites for cleanup. And so I guess I'm just, is what you guys are saying is that this is a housing issue, not an environment issue because brownfield sites have been stabilized?
The most important sites for cleanup are not brownfields. The most important sites for cleanup usually get listed.
Yes, understood.
So those material sites that need to go through the state version of CERCLA.
Understood. So for brownfields that are not CERCLA.
Brownfields that are determined to not require that level of remediation, there still are plans for the management and risk reduction from those sites.
But I think what Representative Chapin is asking, is there a priority list of like, are there brownfields that we know about that pose a hazard to someone just going for a walk with their dog? And does the state prioritize addressing that sort of thing? Or is it only when someone's interested in redeveloping a property that they become of interest to the state?
You need to talk to somebody in the brownfields program. I don't want to answer that question incorrectly.
Yeah.
And I
I just feel like we're playing around with a prioritization scheme that I haven't heard enough about to feel comfortable that the state is going to be able to protect people's health, even if they're changing how they look at these projects related to housing versus other kinds of economic development priorities. That's what I'm trying to get at. I'm not necessarily trying to pit jobs versus housing, but
Right.
I'm just trying to make sure that already some public health in these communities that are affected and are sitting through these projects is being addressed.
So again, you need to talk to somebody from the Brownfields program, but if it's contaminated and it has a public health risk, it should be not available to the public to use. If it's going to be redeveloped and it reaches certain standards, you might have had a regional development corporation get a site to a place where its risk is reduced, it's been covered with soil, it's got a plan, but now it needs to find somebody to develop it. And that they might be open to allow people to walk around on, but it's reached a standard where it has been addressed.
Well, there's also groundwater contamination and other kinds of contamination that affect that community's public health other than physical touch. So.
I mean, they are brownfields. They are managed to a point where the risk is reduced. It's not eliminated. But that is basically a dynamic that happens with a lot of development.
I can talk just offline more with the department about my questions. Thanks.
Representative Logan?
I was just going to ask if we could get more testimony on the Brownfields program. Since it seems like it's not clear how brownfields are prioritized for funding.
Okay, we had Matt Chapman in yesterday. Who else who's,
Somebody from ACTD. I don't know who else is doing it now. But they would be the ones to talk to you about that.
Can I just ask one legal question?
thank you, you better.
So why isn't it the previous property owner? Why is it the state responsibility, not the previous property owner?
The polluter.
Hmm?
The polluter, you mean?
Right.
Mm,
Well, and maybe not know it, but why does the state have that? Why is it our responsibility? It's private property, right?
In most cases, the owner, operator, arranger, transporter of that land is liable. The state may have reached an agreement, a settlement with those persons for the remediation of the site. And then it's the state's responsibility to manage that site. And it becomes, because the state is releasing the subsequent purchaser from liability. Because that liability for the owner, it follows that land going into the future. And it doesn't matter that the current owner didn't own it 40 years ago when the damage was caused. The owner always has that liability unless they get that release letter from the state that says, no, we're not going to hold you liable because you're managing this the way that we want you to manage it.
It's like salt BMPs.
It's a little different.
Is it released from liability after following protocols? Further questions from Michael? He looks ready to go.
I got to take my son to a doctor's appointment and I want to
Fine, it's fair.
make the changes to 86 before I get out of here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We want you to do that too. Thank you, Michael.
All right. Thanks.
All right, before we adjourn again, is there further discussion on things that we're thinking about? Do folks want to learn more about the Brownfields program?
or I'm happy to just. ask
I'm just
questions.
opening the webpage for the DC's Brownfield.
Is health gonna look at it? Is health gonna look at it as well? Or, I mean, or is that all taken care of? Through the agency, that they've already looked at and ruled out health issues, and it could be putting these soils on, good soils.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important, if, is that what we're talking about? No, right now we're talking about what do we lose? What's the loss if we prioritize housing in the brownfields program? I think that's the summary of what we're
I thought you opened it up to
talking about now.
Yeah, so it sounds like Rip Austin has a question about the developed soils too.
Well, yes, we covered that pretty well. We ran out of questions and Michael just left. So
Yeah.
if you have further questions, I would ask you to talk to him directly about it on that topic. Okay, further discussion on this. No, so. All right, with